Hi, I'm Dr. Jeremy Neal, and I'm a professor of philosophy at Houston Baptist University. Today, I want to talk a little bit about immigration as a practical ethics topic. Ethicists do not just work at the normative level or the meta-ethical level, they also work at a practical level, and one of the topics that is of great importance for contemporary nation states is the immigration topic. And I want today to draw upon the ideas of a couple of philosophers, David Miller and Chandran Kukathas, who have both written extensively on this topic. Consider first a question that has been posed to us by Miller, and that is, do people have a right, at least at an abstract level, to live where they want? I'm not so sure that they have such a right. Miller thinks that they do. He thinks that that right, however, is not an absolute right. For instance, you couldn't live in the exact space that I occupy right now because you would harm me. You also couldn't live, perhaps, arguably, on private property that I own without harming me as well. However, Miller thinks that you can live within reason in a variety of different places. So suppose that someone is in a war-torn country in the developing world and is struggling for the basic necessities of life, and she resolves that she is going to move. Is it obligatory for other nations in the world to allow her to enter their borders, to cross their borders and enter their lands, simply because she has the resolve to move, to leave her impoverished location where she is being oppressed, and to go to another country? Well, Miller says she has, at least in an abstract sense, a right to move and to live where she wants, but in a practical sense, she only has a right to move to another country if that other country will take her in. So if that other country is willing to be the fulfiller of her abstract right, then Miller thinks that it is legitimate for her to move to that country. It is justifiable for her to go where she wants in the sense that she can go to that country. In this sense, it seems analogous, the right of living where one wants, if there is indeed such a right. And again, as I mentioned at the outset, I'm not so sure that there is such a right. But for Miller, this right is analogous to the right to marry. He thinks that everyone has an abstract right to be able to marry, at least in his view. But that right can only be concretely realized if you can find another person who is willing to marry you. And in the same sense, the abstract right of living where you want can only be realized in a concrete way if you can find another country besides your own that is willing to take you in. So in that sense, Miller thinks that there are grounds for restricting immigration across the borders of contemporary nation states. Also, and I'm just going to mention one other brief justification that has been offered by David Miller for why nation states are justified in restricting the movement of immigrants across their borders, and that is cultural integrity or continuity. Miller thinks that there is a certain value in the continuity of a stable culture. Cultures have traditions and customs. Often, the different cultures of the world have religious opinions that date back many generations. They have unified histories. Often they are ethnically homogeneous. And Miller thinks that human beings tend to flourish more on balance when they are participants in a continuous culture that is relatively stable and that preserves meaning over time and across generations. If, say, 10 million Americans were to move to the island of Tahiti next week, we would grossly upset the cultural integrity of that island. And Miller thinks that nation states, to some extent at least, have a right to protect themselves and to protect their cultural integrity. Tahiti has a right to restrict immigration for the sake of protecting the cultural integrity of its people and its way of life, and ultimately for the sake of their flourishing, because the flourishing of its people is enhanced by the existence around them of a stable and a continuous culture. This is especially clear in the case of a nation like Israel, which is based on ethnic and religious ties. A nation like that, on this view, has grounds justifiably to restrict immigration by virtue of the fact that the flourishing of its people might be undermined if their cultural integrity were to be undermined by means of the immigration inflows of a large number of persons who do not come from that culture, do not associate with it, and are not familiar with it. This argument perhaps is a little bit less successful for a large and various culture like the United States, although even there it perhaps could be argued that the United States does have a culture. It's just a little bit different than the culture of Israel, and it's predicated on shared political values, some might argue, rather than a shared religious value system or shared ethnic ties. At any rate, I'll talk more about immigration in other lectures, but David Miller does offer us in some compelling reasons, perhaps, that we should consider in the immigration debate, and compelling reasons in particular for limiting the movement of peoples across the borders of different nations.